Located at the foot of the Alps, Salzburg is renowned for its scenic beauty, which has undoubtedly captured the imagination of countless viewers of
The hills are alive with the sound of music.
Yes, the sound of music. But of course, the city is also an important destination for classical music lovers in particular, because Mozart was born here, and his memory is so cherished that his portrait can be found on all the delightful trees called Mozartkugel. In addition to Mozart, other notable citizens from Salzburg include the conductor Herbert von Karajan, as well as the physicist Christian Doppler, who is most famous for describing the Doppler effect. Salzburg truly has a long and rich history. The Romans first founded the city here in the year 15 BC. In fact, Salzburg Cathedral was constructed on the same site where the forum for this ancient Roman city had been. This is where Mozart was baptized. Today, the Altstadt, the historic center of the city, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In this video, we'll consider Mozart's early piano sonatas against the backdrop of this stunning location. And we'll then focus on the piano sonata in D major, Kurschel 284 in particular. As I sat on the train from Vienna to Salzburg, taking in the Austrian countryside, I could not help thinking about the fact that so many composers, from Beethoven to Mahler, found solace and inspiration in the glory of their natural surroundings. This is not a coincidence. Researchers are now discovering that our environment can deeply affect our moods, our thoughts, and therefore our creativity. And though it would be naive to expect that we could re-experience Mozart's Salzburg exactly as he knew it, I believe that visiting his birthplace and walking in his footsteps can still do much to enrich our appreciation of his musical creativity. For many centuries, Salzburg was the capital of an independent, sacred state ruled by prince-archbishops. You can see the portraits of some of these prince-archbishops on the walls of this room in the Hohensalzburg fortress. Archbishop Gebhard ordered the construction of the imposing Hohensalzburg fortress in 1077 to protect the city from invasions. Today it remains the largest fully preserved castle in Central Europe. It's amazing to consider that 260 years ago, the young Mozart would have seen this very structure dominating the skyline. Since 1892, visitors can make their way up to the fortress by riding a funicular. The view from the top is simply breathtaking. Especially notable is the architecture of the old city, which blends Italian and German influences. In the same way, one could say that Mozart's music synthesizes Germanic craftsmanship with a captivating Italianate singing quality. Salzburg flourished and reached the zenith of its power and prestige during the 17th and 18th centuries. It is in this context that we find Mozart's father, Leopold, who was born in Augsburg, Bavaria, but later moved to Salzburg, where he was appointed violinist and composer in the capella of the Prince Archbishop in 1743. After marrying in 1747, Leopold and his wife Anna Maria settled down in a modest apartment at number 9 Getreidegasse. It was here that their 7 children were born. But only 2 would survive to adulthood: Maria Anna, also known as Nano, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Though a prodigiously gifted musician in her own right, Nano would never achieve the enduring fame of her younger brother. As the plaque in front of number 9 Getreidegasse now states, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in this house on January 27, 1756. It's remarkable to note that the house itself may in fact date back to the 12th century. Getreidegasse was, and still is, a busy commercial street at the heart of Salzburg's old city. Today, however, international fashion chains coexist with more traditional businesses, many of which still attract the attention of passers-by with their richly ornamented signs. In 1856, an exhibition celebrating Mozart's centenary was held at No. 9 Getreidegasse. Then in 1870, the International Mozarteum Foundation was formed, and the foundation would set up the Mozart Museum in 1880, becoming the first museum to be established in a composer's former house. Visitors enter the museum through an arched doorway. Then they ascend the stairs to the third floor, where the Mozarts had their apartment. To be sure, materials of direct musical significance are prominently featured in the museum. But more mundane objects are also on display. For example, this is what the Mozart kitchen may have looked like. And here's a cookbook from 18th century Salzburg. These everyday items help to enrich our understanding of the human dimension of the creative artist, which is too often overlooked when we stand in awe of artistic genius and the supposed immortality of the artistic work. Musicians, of course, are likely to find the musical instruments and manuscripts most fascinating. Manuscripts may not be visual masterpieces in their own right, but for the trained musician, they can evoke a world of sound, both immediate and tantalizing. Mozart was recognized as one of the greatest keyboard virtuosos of his day. His first surviving compositions, written when he was 5, were for solo keyboard. These were simple, short dances. But very soon, Mozart started writing sonatas, which, as was typical at the time, were for the keyboard with violin accompaniment. Clearly the work of a young apprentice, these early sonatas seem to have been corrected and revised by his father, and they demonstrate a heavy reliance on the conventional accompanimental figure called the Alberti bass. But Mozart was quickly absorbing the stylistic vocabulary of the music of his time, paving the way for him to make innovative contributions of his own. Like other composers of his day, Mozart would have been keenly aware of the distinction between domestic music and public music. The sonata is a genre that belongs to the former, and it would not be until Beethoven came along that we would find a significant body of solo sonatas thoroughly suitable for public performance. In Mozart's time, the sonata would be played in a private or semi-private setting, perhaps in an aristocratic salon, where the audience members would be well equipped to appreciate the complex musical discourse of the sonata, as they themselves likely had to learn to play sonatas as part of their music education. During Mozart's lifetime, the piano was increasingly becoming the keyboard instrument of choice. Until the mid-1770s, Mozart had been more accustomed to using either the clavichord or the harpsichord. But he quickly realized the advantages of the piano, which in a way combines the clavichord's ability for nuanced expression with the harpsichord's resonant power. In fact, the piano seems to be especially well suited to Mozart's dramatic style. Mozart's first surviving sonatas for solo keyboard date from 1774, when he was 18 years old and already demonstrating artistic maturity. In the Mozart family correspondence, these sonatas are referred to as the difficult sonatas. There had in fact been 4 earlier and presumably easier keyboard sonatas, which unfortunately are now lost. The detailed dynamic indications and the lyrical quality of the melodies suggest that these 6 sonatas were meant to be played on the piano. We cannot know for sure whether Mozart intended these 6 sonatas to be considered as a single unified set. It is obvious, however, that the keys of the 6 sonatas articulate a circle of fifths, reflecting Baroque tradition. These sonatas exhibit an astonishing diversity of characters. For example, the first sonata seems to offer us a glimpse of Mozart as a highly imaginative improviser. The second sonata explores tragic depth in its slow movement. This material already looks a dozen years ahead to the Adagio of his A major piano concerto, Churchill 488. Meanwhile, the somewhat austere opening of the fourth sonata appears to hark back to the Baroque church sonata. The sixth sonata is by far the most ambitious and technically challenging in the set. It is also the only sonata in the set that Mozart chose to publish, which may indicate that he thought very highly of it. Although the first 5 sonatas may have been written in Salzburg, the sixth sonata was composed for Baron Dürnitz in Munich. In this discussion, we'll focus mainly on the first movement, but we'll also take note of several interesting features in the other 2 movements. The first movement is conceived on a grand scale, fully exploiting the piano's ability to suggest an entire orchestra. Unlike in the first 5 sonatas, Mozart had to make substantial revisions in this sonata, most notably in the first movement. This fact is rather remarkable because it challenges the popular notion that Mozart could always compose quickly and effortlessly. In the autograph manuscript, you can see that a page and a half of music have been crossed out. This is a substantial false start that spans the entire exposition and quite a bit of the development section as well. Let's take a look at some of the key differences between the abandoned first version and the final version. In the first version, the opening idea is noteworthy for being 5 measures long, yet manages to sound predictable. It's then immediately repeated, almost verbatim. In the final version, the main theme spans 8 measures, so it would appear to be more regular. However, these 8 measures can be grouped into 3 plus 3 plus 2, making the phrase surreptitiously unsettling. The A pedal established in measure 4 seems to arrive 1 measure early. To understand how this is so, take a closer look at measures 2 and 3. You can see that the motive in measure 2 is replicated twice at double the speed in measure 3. But what if this motive unfolded at the same speed? It would be something like this. Now the phrase feels comfortably regular and much less interesting, so the compression of the motive helps to propel the music toward the A pedal. Once the A pedal is established, the activity above it drives the music toward the transitional material, which begins in measure 9. The main tones in the right hand articulate a patient rise through the dominant 7th chord, followed by a quicker tumble down the same chord. The overall experience is like climbing to the top of a playground slide and then letting gravity do its work in the descent. So once again. In the first version, the transitional material seems to lose momentum, especially in the Much Ado About Nothing figuration in the middle of its initial measures. In the final version, there is a more elegant start to the transition, and the entire section grows organically toward greater rhythmic animation. The insistent pedal in measures 9 to 12 evolves into more active tremolos in measures 13 to 16, which then culminate in rapidly moving parallel 10s between the hands. Note that the phrasing of the transition is completely regular, which provides relief from the unsettling asymmetry inherent in the opening theme. Here is the subordinate theme. The final version of it is not significantly different from the first version. This theme seems to owe much to Johann Christian Bach. So here I want to pause for a moment to consider how Mozart was influenced by J.C. Bach, who studied in Italy and later settled in England, becoming known as the London Bach. When the 8-year-old Mozart spent a year and a half in England during his concert tour as a child prodigy, Bach served as a kind of mentor. Nano's account of how the two of them played together at the keyboard gives a touching picture of their musical interaction. Bach was a pioneer in composing pieces intended for the piano, and the young Mozart certainly learned much from him. Mozart arranged 3 of Bach's piano sonatas as piano concertos, one of which is the sonata in D major, Opus 5, No. 2. You can see that there are similarities between the subordinate theme of Bach's sonata and the subordinate theme of Mozart's sonata. In fact, there are similarities in how both composers conceive the opening theme and transition as well. Note the grand announcement at the start of both pieces, and the right-hand tremolo gesture in the transition. Near the end of the exposition, there is one curious little discrepancy between the original and final versions that I would like to point out. Perhaps to the exasperation of countless piano students today, Mozart did not choose to retain the original version of measure 40, which would be far easier to play than the tricky thirds that we now find in the final version. Because of this technical challenge, I think that there's a strong temptation to distort the rhythm, which would make the figure sound less like the majestic flourish that it is meant to be. In the first version, Mozart concludes the exposition with a quiet two-measure cadential figure that becomes the basis for the development section. But he ultimately abandoned this idea, and the development section was completely rewritten. However, the basic compositional strategy of having the development section explore the concluding figure of the exposition actually resurfaces in another piano sonata in the same key of D major. In the final version, the development section immediately plunges into the minor mode, which comes to permeate the entire section. Mozart's dramatic use of the minor mode here may reflect the influence of his father, who similarly demonstrates an affinity for striking minor mode excursions in his sonatas. The frequent hand-crossing, completely absent in the first version, is an adventurous gesture that also contributes to the drama. We will skip the recapitulation and move on to the second movement. Called Rondo en Polonaise, this movement already gives us a preview of Mozart's fertile variative imagination, which will become the focus of the third movement. Cast in rondo form, the refrain never recurs in exactly the same way. Here is the initial appearance of the refrain. I find the return of the refrain in measure 31 noteworthy because the formerly discrete commentaries of measures 2 and 4 seem to become swollen with comical self-importance. The episode in F-sharp minor is brief but poignant. Note the agitation of the repeated C-sharp over a lament bass, chromatically descending from tonic to dominant. The final appearance of the refrain is by far the most impressively elaborate. The finale is a substantial movement in variation form. If any passage in this sonata could be described as perfected beauty, I think it would certainly be the Andante theme upon which 12 variations are based. The theme appears to be the paragon of classical balance, simplicity, and elegance. However, you can see that the two halves of the theme are not exactly the same length, because there is an extra measure of mainly silence in the second half, and this is actually the most meaningful moment in the theme. This extra measure is retained in all the variations that follow, and I believe that Mozart would probably have taken advantage of this moment, whenever appropriate, to improvise a brief cadenza during his performance of this music. I should also point out that there seems to be a subtle link between the second and third movements. The cadential figure that concludes each half of the theme can also be found at the end of the second movement. Overall, the variations are brilliant, presenting a variety of technical challenges and demanding good agility in both hands. For example, the right hand running 16th notes in Variation 3 migrate to the left hand in Variation 4. Variation 4 also demonstrates good humor in its somewhat grotesque displacement of the initial A to the low register. Strategically placed at the midpoint, Variation 7 is the only variation in the tonic minor. To me, the throbbing syncopated accompaniment and the intense chromaticism already offer some hint of what is to come in the great D minor piano concerto. Marked Adagio cantabile, Variation 11 differs from the preceding variations because the repeats are written out. When Mozart published this sonata, he decided to make the embellishments even more elaborate. Therefore, this variation gives us valuable insights into Mozart's art of ornamentation. The last variation appropriately feels like a light-hearted summary. Marked allegro and cast in 3/4, there is a sense that the now familiar musical content has been compressed into a kind of joyful dance. So let's conclude by listening to this entire variation. Thanks for watching.